Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Interim Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Courtney Thorsson, Assistant Professor of English at the University of Oregon. She teaches, studies, and writes about African American literature from its beginnings to the present. Thorsson's first book, Women's Work, argues that African American women's novels of the 1980s and 1990s reclaim and revise Black cultural nationalism. Thorsson was the 2012-2013 Oregon Humanities Center Faculty Research Fellow. Her fellowship term was spent working on her current book project, Revolutionary Recipes, Foodways in African American Literature, which examines the ways culinary discourse and the recipe form articulates race, gender, and class in African American literature. Thorsson is also the recipient of UO's 2014 Early Career Award, the highest university award for early career faculty, intended to recognize and celebrate an emerging and significant record of scholarship and research. Thank you, Courtney, for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the nice introduction.
You're very welcome. What led to your interest in African American literature?
It's so long-standing, it's almost hard to say. So, as an undergraduate, I was a double major in English and African American Studies. And I came by the second major in African American Studies at a University of Virginia when the director of that program called me into his office and said, well, I know you're an English major, but all the electives you've taken count for African American Studies and you have enough credits for a second major. So my interest had sort of found me without me knowing that. So when I went into graduate school, I really went to focus on African American literature with a focus on 20th century in my scholarship.
So your first book, Women's Work, Nationalism and Contemporary African American Women's Novels, was published last year. What sorts of women's work does your book study?
In women's work, I think about 5 forms of women's work, one in each novel. So my 5 forms of work are organizing, dancing, mapping, cooking, and inscribing. And by inscribing, I mean making textual and non-textual markings. And these kind of labors, right, we might automatically think of cooking or dancing as women's work. But we put those labors next to mapping, inscribing, or organizing. We can understand that all 5 labors are political, as we might expect organizing to be, and are theoretical or intellectual, as we might expect mapping and inscribing to be. So considering them as a group is really important to the project under that rubric of women's work.
So explain how you see these particular forms of women's work as contributing to cultural nationalism. How is it that they do that thing?
Sure. So like all the work I do, I just start with what's happening in the text. So I didn't come to a bunch of novels of the 80s and 90s thinking about work or thinking about nationalism. But what I noticed is that the 5 authors who I write about here, so it's Toni Cade Bambara, Gloria Naylor, Paul Marshall, Ntozake Shange, and Toni Morrison, all in the 1980s and 90s kept referring to themselves as cultural nationalists and talking about African Americans as making up a nation or a cultural nation or a nation within a nation. Now these are decades where it's totally out of fashion to talk that way. So scholars in the humanities are thinking about the global South, the Black diaspora, the Black Atlantic, transnational or hemispheric kind of study, because this is well past the heyday of Black nationalism in the 60s and 70s. So I really just came to the project through the why. Why do these women keep saying nation and cultural nationalism? And they were all writing these novels in the 80s and 90s that were focused on African American women characters in relationship to their broader communities. And that's actually quite different from novels of the 1970s. So if we think about Morrison's early fiction or Gail Jones's novels of the 1970s were a kind of recovery project that gave individual African American women subjectivity, its kind of due and its thick focus. And then in the 80s and 90s, these authors, Bambara, Naylor, Shange, Morrison, and Marshall, try to put that individual subjectivity into the context of a cultural nation. So they reclaim this kind of Black Power 60s and 70s era language of nationalism, but really revise the gender of that movement by incorporating that 1970s mode of thick, complicated Black female subjectivity into fiction.
So why did you choose the novels that you chose? Did they choose you too?
it would be false to say anything other than that I love them. Like most of us as literary critics, whether we admit it or not, we choose to work on texts we think are beautiful or are important and that we want people to read or reread or read more insightfully, right? So I think these are books people should pay attention to. I also think the 5 novels I look at, and this maybe is especially the case for Toni Cade Bambara's 1980 novel, The Salt Eaters, and Toni Morrison's 1997 novel, Paradise, is that they're often called difficult, and they don't get taught in undergraduate classrooms as often as I think they should be because they're cast as difficult novels. So the work of literary scholarship is to help us be better readers of texts. So I tried to really write a book that would make it possible for an undergraduate to get some help writing a term paper on The Salt Eaters or Paradise, or see something maybe in those novels they didn't see on first reading, but also to understand how a novel like Gloria Naylor's Mama Day, which students read as a little easier, is actually as theoretically sophisticated in thinking about particularly African American female identity as the books we might call quote unquote difficult. So considering them as a group is really just about making books I think are important easier for people to read and study and think about.
So you just mentioned this point about the theoretical component. Say a little bit more about how you understand literary text, novels, to be theoretical, doing theoretical work. Why is that the case?
So when I decided to call my book Women's Work, one of the kinds of work that I think is happening in these novels is the theorization of identity. I'm absolutely not unique in reading African American literature and other cultural production as doing theoretical work. We need only think of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which is essentially teasing out the theory of double consciousness as articulated by Du Bois in 1903 in The Souls of Black Folk. So there's a long-standing tradition in African American literature of theorizing identity. Because theory or intellectual labor is often gendered male, it's important for me to group that theoretical work with these other labors, this dancing, this cooking, this mapping, and inscribing in these texts as the work that the authors are both describing their characters as doing, but also that they're doing themselves, right? And we can also think of this in terms of all of these novels work to undo the notion of a mind-body split. So in kind of African diasporic thinking, that comes particularly from the Caribbean. So Paul Marshall's 1983 novel, Praise Song for the Widow, is where you most see this kind of questioning and theorization of the separation of the body from the mind, or the intellect from the work, right? And her protagonist, A.V. Johnson, lays on a hotel room bed in Grenada and takes a journey through, in her mind, through her past and through her marriage and through her travels up into that point. And it ends up becoming a kind of sifting through not just her own individual past, but really a collective African-American past that helps her understand her experiences as an immigrant growing up in New York. So when I think about theorization, that's an example of how theorization works, right? Marshall there is theorizing that the physical labor of dancing that A.V. Johnson will go on to do is absolutely dependent on the intellectual labor of sifting through and organizing an individual and collective Black past.
Interesting. So your current book project, Revolutionary Recipes, studies foodways in African American lit. What led you to that project? How'd you get there?
So in the first book, Women's Work, I have a chapter on cooking in Ntozake Shange's 1982 novel, Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo. Originally, that chapter also dealt with Shange's really wild, experimental 1998 book, If I Can Cook, You Know God Can, which is a travelogue, cookbook, memoir, to name just a few of the genres in which it trades. And so that Shange chapter ballooned to twice the size of any other chapter in my first book, and it broke the chronology of the book. And, you know, more than one editor told me, okay, it's time to get rid of half of that chapter. But also, like, I had a lot to say about how food works in African American literature. And so as I started to think more about that and kind of let the texts pile up, I had things from, you know, Paul Laurence Dunbar has the 1903 poem Possum, which is a recipe for skinning and preparing possum. Or something like Claude McKay's The Tropics in New York, which is thinking about produce from all over the African diaspora in a food stand in Harlem to theorize and articulate in a culinary idea of Black diaspora that includes both Jamaica and Harlem, right? Or, you know, in McKay's novel Banjo, where the protagonist orders a fancy dish in Marseille, gets it and says, oh, this is just chitlins, right? And then the American South and France are on the same map. You know, I could go on, clearly. But so as the stat kind of piled up, I realized that I think that uses of both the recipe form and culinary discourse are a definitional characteristic of African American literature from its beginnings to the present. So this is part of what motivates the Foodways project, in the sense that I think it's actually pretty urgent right now in this moment to continue to identify African American literature as a distinct body of work that requires its own specialists. And one of the ways we do this, and one of the ways I do it when I teach my regular survey course, is to collaborate with people to establish what are those lists of formal and thematic traits that define this tradition. And once you notice something like double consciousness, you understand how to read The Invisibility in Ellison, or the passing narrative in James Weldon Johnson or Nella Larson. So really these texts become so much richer for us in the context of a tradition. And I'm just trying to think about the strand of that tradition that's Foodways writing. So I'm considering cookbooks, poetry, and fiction.
So just briefly define the term foodways.
Sure. So Foodways, as opposed to food studies, I think it's important to say, has that word ways, which refers to both ways of doing things, ways of preparing a dish, practices of cooking, and routes that foodstuffs travel, whether across the diaspora or otherwise. So it's really meant to evoke that kind of the migratory pattern of foodstuffs and also the practice of food preparation.
So you've just alluded to food studies. What are they? What's that?
Yeah, so food studies is, you know, a burgeoning field all over the country, and here, absolutely, at University of Oregon, where we especially have some graduate students doing great kinds of work in food studies. Food studies, I would say, thinks more about data than Foodways does. So as I say, when I presented parts of this Foodways work at food studies conferences, and I always say at the outset of those panels, so you all are talking about facts, and I'm talking about representations of those facts, right? Because I'm a literary scholar, and the thing I know how to do is think about representation and what's significant about the ways that my authors represent food. So I think that's a little bit of the difference. You know, folks in food studies are thinking about really important things like agricultural systems, like migrant food labor, like, you know, historical facts about the ways certain foodstuffs have moved, been consumed, and, you know, what the geography of those foods is. And so I really depend on food studies to do Foodways work, but what I'm doing is Foodways.
So can you say a little bit about what the particular contribution that a study of African American, representations of African American foodways contributes to our understanding of food studies on the one hand, and also of African American literary tradition on the other?
Sure. So to answer the first bit first, so studying African American literature in terms of foodways solves a kind of danger in food studies that's happening right now, which is that and also food culture more broadly, the kind of US foodie culture, if you will, that tends to represent locavore or organic or vegan or vegetarian food movements as really white and middle class. And when I look at something like Ntozake Shange's recipes that would call for using a mother's handkerchief and facing the direction of the South, there's a place, race, and a gender to that recipe. And so I'm really interested in contributing specificity about place, race, gender, and economic class to the food studies conversation. Now, what food studies or foodways has to offer to the study of African American literature is, like any lens, any studies lens, is to help us think more deeply and complexly about what goes on in African American literature. So one thing for me that's been incredibly rewarding is that in the work I'm doing on poetry right now, I'm writing about the poetry of Evie Shockley and Harriet Mullen, two 21st century African-American women poets active now. They both give recipe instructions and have lots of culinary language in their poetry. And what I've come to, and I'm really excited about, is that they're both using foodways as a way to write vernacular poetry without retreading the innovations of their predecessors, like dialect or phonetic representation of speech, or the ballad form, right? Other things we think of as oral and vernacular. These women authors in the 21st century are using food to be vernacular. Everybody eats. We get it. And so that's the kind of thing that we can see when we use food as a lens to look at the African American literary tradition.
Fascinating. One of the contributions that I know the project makes is to think about the recipe as a genre, as a literary form. How did you come to that idea, and tell us about that literary form?
So I came to that idea through noticing recipes in African American fiction and poetry first, which then led me to cookbooks. So I've mentioned the Dunbar poem, and I've mentioned in Shanghai's novels just inserting recipes. One scholar, Patricia Clark, calls Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo a recipistolary novel. So, you know, trying to account for the inclusion of recipes, but also that made me turn to cookbooks. So something like the Darden Sisters' 1978 cookbook, Spoon Bread and Strawberry Wine. It's an archive of generations of Black family history told through recipes, each identified with a specific immediate or atavistic ancestor, that tells the story of generations of African Americans in the Darden family striving through economic thrift and kind of uplift ideology to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and succeed in the United States. Now, this is quite conservative, right? And the idea that a recipe for preserving and canning is at that same moment preserving and archiving and canning a kind of static Black linear history that's about uplift, success, and achievement, I think is just really one worth looking at. And it's a reason why we actually have to read cookbooks with the same kind of serious attention that we would use for poetry or fiction.
So you understand cookbooks to be a form of literature.
Correct.
So you've just described one cookbook that you study that is conservative in its orientation. Tell me about a cookbook that you study that's more radical in its orientation.
So I would have to say Vertime Grosvenor's 1970 cookbook, Vibration Cooking or the Travel Notes of a Geechee Girl, which is first-person narration from self-declared culinary anthropologist Vertime Grosvenor's persona. I think it's important to notice that it's a persona. And this sort of story of her life, first as a girl in South Carolina, then as a single mother living in New York, and traveling throughout Europe, told through recipes. So what a radical recipe looks like in Vertime Grosvenor is the entire section for cocktails in Vibration Cooking reads as follows. The only cocktail I know how to make is a Molotov, and I would be a fool to give the recipe here. What Vertime Grosvenor is telling you in 1970 is that it would actually be dangerous in the era of COINTELPRO, at the height of the Black Power movement in 1970, to give the kind of didactic instructions that she does give you for things like chicken and dumplings, or gumbo, or Jimmy Carter's barbecue sauce, among other things.
You are, as well as an active and innovative scholar, a devoted teacher. You teach a range of courses in African American lit and culture. How do you understand your responsibilities as a teacher to this literary tradition?
The first priority for me as a teacher of African American literature is to get students to read texts in that tradition, get them excited about those texts, and then make them want to go on to read more books in that literary tradition. That's the first step of the job. Then to help them be better critical readers, thinkers, and writers about that text, to engage and express their opinions about those texts. In that vein, chronology is a very powerful tool. I am teaching the Survey of African American Literature for the 8th time since my arrival at University of Oregon. It is a total delight for me that students continue to have an appetite for that course. What a privilege to just be again and again reading Frederick Douglass with 40 kids who are reading it for the first time. So to kind of model that delight, I think, is part of the job, to offer the survey as often as there are students to fill it, but also upper division and graduate courses that might be more focused to allow students to really delve into a specific time period. So I regularly teach one course that's on African American writing from about 1870 to about 1920, the period sometimes known as the nadir, after Reconstruction of American history, because that was a time of extreme repressive racial violence in this country. We might miss the fact that some really incredible writing came out of that period. So Paul Laurence Dunbar, Anna Julia Cooper, Frances Harper, and these are texts students have definitely not read in other courses or read before they get to college, right? So a course like that is just important in opening up an opportunity for our University of Oregon students to really understand the incredible complexity and diversity of African American literary expression, whether it's in 1877 or 1977 or 2014. So the time-restricted courses, I think, are really important for giving that kind of depth and diversity.
How's your scholarship been informed by your teaching? Has it been?
It has been, and probably in more ways than I know exactly how to articulate, because that's sort of happening every day, right? But I've learned from my students some of those things I need to make explicit in my scholarship. So we talked about, my assumption that novels are doing theoretical work and that African American literature is doing theoretical work, is theorizing identity. I've learned from my students I need to say that aloud. That assumption is one I need to name. My scholarship and my teaching are equally motivated by the idea that African American literature is a tradition that requires its own teachers, scholars, specialists, and students, right? And actually, in the survey course, I ask the students if they think that's true on the first day, and then we talk about it again on the last day. And their answers really teach me quite a lot about the necessity for the field and how I need to articulate it, and actually that's just an imperative of all the scholarship I do.
So can you say a little bit more about the specifics of that? What's behind that statement? I mean, when you ask them that question at the beginning of the class and the end of the class, is there a change around that question?
There is often a change around that question. So sometimes on the first day they can throw out a few names. So maybe they say Toni Morrison, maybe they say Maya Angelou. They might have an idea of a few names we might study. And they sort of start out thinking, well, it's literature by Black people. And then we talk about what's Black mean? What's African American mean, right? And I use Black to refer to the African diaspora, and I use African American to refer to people of African descent in the United States. So they kind of start out with identity of author, and by the end they're able to say things like, well, what characterizes the African American literary tradition is formal innovation, the trope of masking, uses of double consciousness, formal and thematic uses of music, and so on and so on. And then towards the end, this is great fun for me, I give them Toni Morrison's 1984 essay, Rootedness, the Ancestor as Foundation, in which Morrison mounts her argument for what defines the tradition. And we make a Morrison's list, and then we make English 241's list. And the thing that's great fun is that after 10 weeks, to really see them gain the confidence to engage Toni Morrison and disagree with her, right? And that's the thing I want them to leave the room with.
In addition to your teaching, your research, and your writing, you spend a significant amount of time and energy organizing symposia, readings, and other events. Last night, for example, you hosted a film and a filmmaker, an African-American filmmaker, and a film about African-American women during the Civil Rights Movement. Mm-hmm. Why is that such an important part of your identity as a scholar and an academic?
First, in terms of responsibility to my students, I identify as white, and I'm in a job teaching African American literature, which means I have an opportunity to give my undergraduate and graduate students chances to engage with African American intellectuals that they might not otherwise come by quite so easily in the Pacific Northwest. So that feels like a responsibility to my students for me. But it's also a great opportunity to express to the students that there's discussion, diversity, debate, everything from documentary films to people studying comic books to novelists to historians, working in this field, right? That it's a big, wide, and diverse field, African American studies. And to just give students some tastes of that is really important. And it's just really important for me intellectually. So I love working closely with my colleagues in ethnic studies here. This is the first institution where I've ever taught or studied where I'm not also working in an African American studies department. And so it's just incredibly enriched my intellectual life here to be able to engage scholars who come and question and push back against my work, or who allow me to kind of participate in the conversation going on in the larger field of African American studies. And I'm really happy to have the support of my department and institution in having some of that conversation here in Eugene.
You didn't say the benefit to your colleagues. Can you say, why don't you say something about your intention in relation to that? Because it isn't just for you and it isn't just for your students, right?
Right. So many of my colleagues require or invite their students to attend. So there's that part, right? It reaches beyond just my students, but to my colleagues' classes. But I think, and I'll just say actually particularly just about colleagues in the English department, I work with a bunch of literary scholars who are remarkably excited to engage with work that overlaps only slightly on a Venn diagram with their own. And so it's a lot of fun to have my colleagues in the English department who are willing to go way out of time period or way out of field to populate the room when I do these events and ask brilliant questions and engage and bring their students.
Well, thank you for that compliment to your colleagues. Thank you so much for talking with us today and telling us about your interesting work and your teaching and your service at the University of Oregon.
Thank you, Paul.
I've been speaking with Courtney Thorsson, Assistant Professor of English at the University of Oregon. She's the author of Women's Work, Nationalism, and Contemporary African American Women's Novels. Congratulations on your award for early career.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for watching.